Hello everyone and welcome to round 10 of the Magnus Invitational. We are continuing our coverage with the match Fabiano Caruana versus Hikaru Nakamura, and it is game 1 of their match, and already quite the game. So without further ado, let's check it out, and we're gonna check out the standings after this round. So Fabi with the white pieces opens with d4, and interestingly Nakamura again sticks with the same line he played against both Magnus and against Alireza. So knight f6, we have c4, e6, knight to f3 and d5, so the queen's gambit declined, and knight to c3. He goes for bishop to e7 and now bishop to f4, same as Alireza and Magnus played against Hikaru. We have castles and e3 now. Knight b to d7 and c5 now. If you remember that line where we mentioned you cannot go b6 because of c6, so first Nakamura blocks it with c6, and now both Magnus and Firouzja played h3 against Hikaru here, but here Fabi prepares h4, and it is a new move in the position. So obviously Fabi knew that Hikaru would once again repeat this line. I don't know if I mentioned, it is as of move 8 that we have a completely new game. So Hikaru continues as he usually does. We have b6 challenging the c5 pawn, which may or may not be overextended. b4, we have a5 attacking that b4 pawn again, and now a3. And now knight to e4 by Nakamura, attacking the c3 knight here. We have knight captures by Fabi, d captures, and knight to e5, where Nakamura just captures as the c6 pawn is under attack. You could defend it with this, but then you allow white to switch his knight over to c4 to put additional pressure on b6. So instead, captures, and queen to d5 now. A very active square for Nakamura's queen. Should Fabi go for something like rook to c1 to prepare bishop to c4, because the white rook left the a file, black is very happy to close with b5. So instead, bishop to e2, Fabi just continues continues to castle, and now bishop to a6. Here Nakamura simply trades everything off. We have castles, bishop captures, we have queen captures, and now a captures on b4. We have a captures on b4, a captures on b4, b captures on c5, b captures, and now Nakamura goes for bishop captures on c5, which if pawn captures, then you recapture here and you won a pawn. But Fabi says 2 can play that game. He goes for bishop captures on g7 instead. Now if king captures, you can just play d captures on c5, which is what happened in the game. Hikaru captured as his rook was under attack, so d captures on c5, and now not grabbing the pawn. If you grab the pawn, you just trade it for this pawn, just queen g4 check picks it up, so not really doing anything. So queen to e5 instead, keeping an eye on the pawn here. But now rook a to d1 by Fabi, preparing rook to d4, again to put additional pressure on this e4 pawn. So rook to a5, now Nakamura goes for the c5 pawn with the rook, and now rook to d4. That's not a rook to d4 as planned. So king to h8, finally getting the king away from this queen g4 check, and now g3 by Fabi. And finally rook captures on c5. So for the moment Nakamura is up a pawn, and it's a very nice passed c pawn. So rook to b1 by Fabi. Fabi will now use this. Nakamura is up a pawn and has a passed c-pawn, but his king is also a bit vulnerable, so Fabi will try to shift all the rooks and the queen into the attack. So rook to d5, Nakamura now is ready, of course, to trade material as he's up a pawn. So rook to c4, now Fabi just attacks the pawn. We have c5, the pawn is now nicely defended here, and the queen to c2. Fabi adds more attackers to the pawn. And f5 by Nakamura, getting rid of his well, maybe weak f7 pawn, and in the future, who knows, maybe you can even push to f4. We have rook to a4 by Fabi, now preparing some nice rook lifts, as you've seen in the thumbnail of the video, and now rook f to d8. Preparing to go down with the rooks. Rook to d2 may be an idea if the b rook leaves the back rank, maybe even rook to d1 check, but it's still unclear how you will get the queen to join the attack. So here Fabi says there's no danger along the back rank, just rook to b7, and now of course he wants to play rook a7 and try and checkmate the black king. So rook 5 to d7, of course Nakamura cannot allow that, and now rook to a8 by Fabi. A nice idea that now forces the trade of one of the rooks, but one of his rooks will remain in the attack. So here Nakamura decides to capture the b7 pawn with the idea that the king will be very safe on g7. So rook captures d8 with check, king g7, and now king to g2. Fabio also improves the safety of his king, and now rook to c7. Nakamura now puts a rook behind the passed pawn, and he's ready to push it. We have queen to a4. Now saying, do you start pushing and allow queen to e8, which will result in some very nasty checks in the back rank, or do you start defending? So here c4 does seem like the way to go, but it looks very scary, and especially if you're low on the clock. So instead Nakamura went back, queen to f6, so the queen can also help out with the defense, and queen to e8 by Fabi. King to h6, and now comes rook to d6. Like I said, I guess it was better to just start pushing the pawn, as now you are really in a position where you have to defend. And the problem is, with a move like rook to e7, you no longer have a rook behind the passed pawn, and you're very passive here. For example, queen c8 goes after the pawn, and now if you persist in defending it with queen to e5, now you can even lose the game. Queen f8 check connects with the rook. You have to move rook g7, now rook to c6, again with a double attack on the pawn here. And if you try something like c4 to get it away from there, rook c5 now attacks the queen. Queen moves, and now rook back to c7 with a double attack on the rook. And the problem is, even if you retreat the queen, rook to f7 is deadly, threatening rook to f6 check, followed by queen captures here, and just a whole lot of complications that there's no reason for black to go into. So instead of rook to e7, king to g7, Nakamura goes back with the king, and now again not capturing the pawn right away, but rather we have queen to b8. Also, you could go for just rook captures on e6, but then Fabi thought that, okay, queen f7, I grabbed the pawn, but maybe he can force a queen trade here. You could force a trade of rooks here with captures and captures, but then again, after king h7, you capture here, and you get this where Fabi is up a pawn, but it's a queen and pawn endgame, so very unclear if you will be able to do anything here. So to keep chances alive, queen back to b8 by Fabi now attacks the rook, and rook back to f7 by Nakamura. Rook to c6, now preparing to grab on c5, and now rook to d7. And again, Fabi in no rush to capture the pawn, he just goes rook to c8 once again. As both of them are very low on time, you constantly have to check what happens after rook to g8 check, so it is very useful, and you can always grab the c5 pawn. So king back to h6 by Nakamura, and only now rook captures on c5. So now Fabi eliminated the passed c pawn, and it's now equal material, with Fabi's pawn structure much better, and Hikaru's king is a bit loose here. So rook to g7, now Hikaru knows that, well, it's probably a draw, let's just defend this, and now rook to c6. Again, Fabi will try to create some chances here. We have rook to e7, not allowing a double attack, but also already defending it twice. We have rook back to c8, and here Nakamura played rook to f7. But rook to f7, although it seems like it guards from rook to f8, and that everything is okay, it's actually a move that loses Hikaru the game. So feel free to pause the video and try to find this, winning idea for Fabi while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations, as it's not an easy idea to find. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's a rook to e8. Point is that now you're threatening queen d6 and just grabbing the e6 pawn. And it's not easy to defend it. For example, if you try something like, let's say you make a slow move, let's say king g6, just queen d6, and there's no more defending it. So rook to e7 is not possible. So instead, after this rook to e8 move, Nakamura immediately went rook to e7, but now comes Fabi's main idea, queen to d8. You cannot trade because the queen hangs. So rook back to f7 here, but now Fabi has just a monster move. So even pause the video once again and try to find this beautiful idea again while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the move that Fabi missed in the game. And for those of you that just want to enjoy the show, it's of course rook captures on e6, which wins the queen. And of course, if you capture, that's no better. Then comes queen to g5 checkmate. So the reason Fabio missed this is because he found another winning line and he decided that there's no reason to look any further. He played queen to d6, now just threatening to pick up the e6 pawn and win the queen. So king h5 by Nakamura, but rook captures an e6. Now one pawn falls. Queen to g7 and now queen to f4. Again, threatening some very nasty ideas. So here rook to f6. Nakamura, of course, wants to try and force a queen and pawn endgame, but now comes g4 with check. So what do you do here? If you capture, you just lose the rook, so that's no good. If you capture with the queen, it's not much better. Just queen captures on g4, and then the rook is left defenseless. So here, king to h4, king captures on h4 was played. King to g6 is no better. If you go king to g6, then queen g5 check, king to f7, and now you just win the queen with rook e7 check. You force the king back, and now queen captures here. So that would be also very unfortunate. So Nakamura played king captures on h4, but now comes g5 with check. And it was in this position on move 47 that Hikaru Nakamura resigned the game, and Fabi takes game 1 of their match. So it was a very intense, and it's a really important, of course, match for both of them, as each of them, I think, has a chance to overtake Magnus in the leaderboard. So we'll see what happens in the other 3 games. So here you resign, the only move is king h5, and now it's just rook captures on f6, as now the pawn guards the rook, you are down on rook, and of course there's no defense against rook to h6. So really, really wild game. Could have gone either way. It's really amazing how Fabi allowed Nakamura to have that passed c-pawn, but in the end Nakamura couldn't really do anything with it. So excellent preparation by Fabi, and he definitely knew his way around the position better than Nakamura. So yeah, once again, I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Terence Nolan, Jan Oraske, Steve Vaca, Thomas Connors, and Roland Miller for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Magnus Invitational until it finishes. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.